The message today sounds like I'm rewriting it on the fly. That might be because it's happening. Even after working on this for a week, it's kind of difficult because to read the passage from Amos is a very jarring one. And you pair that up with the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, and they really seek to take us out of our comfort zone. Certainly Amos, writing almost 800 years before the Gospel was written, the Gospel of Matthew, that's what he was trying to do with the people that he was preaching to. Because again, he was preaching to people who were very comfortable in their religious practices, the way they were doing them. This was in northern Israel. They thought they were doing the right thing, but he says to them, "Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. Why would you have the day of the Lord? It is darkness and not light, as if a man fled from a lion and a bear met him. Or a man went into the house and leaned with his hand against the wall, and a serpent bit him." So he's saying, we think we're doing something right. We think we're doing something that makes us comfortable. We think makes us safe from the Lord, and it turns out we're not. Now you fast forward 800 years to the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, and you find something just as troubling. Because Jesus, after all, has been preaching now for 3 years, and he's been preaching generally very loving thoughts, very loving ideas, forgiveness, turning to the Lord, forgiving your neighbor, treating your neighbor as you would yourself. And now comes this story of the 10 bridesmaids, and the climax of the story is very harsh. So we have the 10 young women who were chosen to be part of the bridal party, and this was a great and joyous honor in those days. It didn't just mean that you had to wear a dress that you didn't really like. It meant that these 10 women were part of the party that would greet the bridegroom and see him united with the bride, and then they would walk from the bride's house to the new place where they were going to live, the bride and the groom together, and they would light the way with their lamps. So it was a great honor. It was a big deal, especially in the smaller towns in Israel. Right away after they're selected, things sort of start to come apart at the seams a little bit because the bridegroom is late. And that seems really strange because a bridegroom in those days would not be late for his own ceremony. Even today, if he knows what's good for him, he won't be late for his own ceremony. So it was socially unacceptable, so why would you even plan for such a thing? But still we have 5 of these bridesmaids who did plan. They brought extra oil for their lamps, and we have 5 who did not. But even together, the 10 waited, and eventually they fell asleep. And when they woke up to find that the groom was near, the 5 foolish or gullible bridesmaids. Gullible is also a translation from the Greek that works. They find that because they've been waiting so long, their lamps are burning down and they're almost out of oil, and they turn to their fellow bridesmaids and ask for oil, and they are rejected. No. Sounds like a personal problem. You better figure out what you're going to do. So they go off and they find oil, and they come back and they find that the house is sealed up and the door is closed. And they won't be let in. And there they are in the outer darkness, alone, listening to the sounds of music and the bubbly voices of the partygoers on the other side of the closed door, and they are forever banished. And as I said earlier, in a ministry that is filled gentleness. It's filled with 3 years of gentle teaching and preaching about kindness and mercy and healing. A ministry where Jesus seems to talk constantly about forgiveness and acceptance and being open to alleviating the pain of others. A ministry in Matthew's Gospel, a ministry that started with the Beatitudes, here ends with this stark parable. And the one that follows it, this simple warning, can be summed up in Jesus saying, you should have prepared better. And the door being slammed in their faces. Doesn't really fit with what we know about Jesus. And as with so much of the Bible, sometimes you can see it a little better if you take a couple of steps back. Sometimes you can see how the pieces fit together a little bit better if you step back and you get some perspective. And you look at what the context is. So where does this story fit into the ministry of Jesus? Where does it fit into the history of that collection of books that we call the Bible? And fortunately, we know the answers to both of those questions. Within that 3-year span of Jesus' life where he was preaching and teaching and healing and helping, this particular set of stories, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids and the parable that comes after that, those are part of what the scholars call the Olivet Discourse, which simply means it's a set of teachings that were delivered on the Mount of Olives, which is also known as Mount Olivet. And these were teachings that came at the very end of Jesus' ministry, like days before he knew he was going to be arrested and executed. These are teachings that focus on the end times. These are teachings that focus on apocalyptic language that describes things that are hidden from us in the here and now, and sometimes are even cloaked in metaphor, in allegory. But Jesus is teaching these last important lessons, knowing that his days are numbered. And that explains, I think, the intensity of the language and the starkness of the picture that he paints with these words. Because knowing as he does that the final act in his ministry is nearing, Jesus is struggling as hard as he can to make clear to the disciples just what he's trying to say. He's trying to just pound this message into their heads using as harsh and brutal a language as he thinks it takes. These are important concepts to get across, and if the disciples are going to be motivated for what they need to do after he's gone, which is to spread the good news, and they need to understand everything that he's saying. So we find that the Olivet Discourse is the equivalent of that revered teaching tool, the 2x4, alongside the head. It's Jesus saying, wake up! Listen, this is important stuff I'm telling you. We can imagine that it must have had that effect. The parable itself was written down somewhere between 30 and 50 years after Jesus was crucified. Experts can't really agree on any more refined date than that. And telling this story at this point in the narrative allows the writer of Matthew to address a problem in the early church. Because here Jesus has been executed, he's risen, he's resurrected. And it's been 30, 50 years. And members of the early church are now looking around saying, why are we still here? Because Jesus had spoken so fervently and eloquently about the coming kingdom of heaven, and his disciples had spoken of it so urgently as well that the early church just assumed that the kingdom of heaven was just around the corner. And of course, that was probably a great motivator as they were out teaching, because they could say, Judgment Day is coming soon. Are you ready? Jesus is coming. Have you given your life to him? And with all of that talk, everybody just assumed that the second coming was going to happen in their lifetime. And then as the first generation of the early church died out, and the second coming hadn't happened, and as the next generation was getting older and it hadn't happened, people were starting to question why. And they were sort of starting to lose their way. So as these events, as these teachings from Jesus were being written down in the gospel, it was helpful to include this parable to remind people that nobody knew. Nobody knows when the kingdom of heaven is coming. And the story also, from a literary standpoint, also kind of neatly foreshadows the disciples, Jesus' most trusted disciples, who fell asleep while he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. It was a reminder that even the most faithful can lose their way. And it was a reminder to early followers of Christ and all of those who would come after, up to and including us, that it is important to be ready at all times, because we don't want to be caught flat-footed, but you can't assume that the kingdom of heaven is going to happen tomorrow. We don't know. So if we look at the bridesmaids, the 10, who were the wise ones and who were the foolish ones? So remember, they all fell asleep. They all got bored, they all got drowsy, they got fed up with waiting, and they dozed off. And they all had lamps, and they all had oil. But it's just that 5 of them were paranoid enough, if you want to call it that, to bring extra oil, just in case. Just in case the groom doesn't show up when he's supposed to. We know he should, but just in case. And there were 5 that didn't think they would need it. They thought that whatever they had right at the moment was enough to get them through until the bridegroom came and they could execute their duties. 5 of them thought they could just coast by on whatever they happened to have in their lamp. So the wise 5, the prepared 5, are those followers of Christ who have accepted him. They are followers of Christ within whom the fire of salvation is lit, and it glows in their soul like that lamp that the bridesmaids are carrying. They're also the ones who are working to make sure that that flame stays lit. They are working to make sure that they feed the flame. They watch it grow so it can light the way for themselves and for all of the others that they're going to be teaching in their life. All of the others that they're going to be reaching out to. Until the time comes for that great procession to the new home. Until the time comes when Christ is reunited with his church on earth. These Christians, they learn and they study and they act like Christians. They're born to a new life and they're grateful for it. They're eager to share it with others, and they stand ready to carry Christ's light out into the world. They're prepared. Now the other 5, they also have that same flame within them, that flame of salvation, but they're not really prepared to keep it lit. They just assume that once it's lit, it's going to burn forever, and they don't really have to tend to it. Or at least it's going to burn long enough to get them to the second coming. These five see being a follower of Christ as more of a passive thing. They see salvation as an event and not a life choice, not a way of life. In the end, of course, they find out that that's not enough, because if they're not fortunate enough to have the kingdom of heaven come when their fervor is at its peak, and they're going to find that they've missed the party. So knowing the context and knowing the narrative, what is the story? What does the parable tell us 2,000 years later? It tells us that becoming a Christian happens as a result of an initiating event. Becoming a Christian happens when you're born again, or when you're baptized, or when one of those events comes and you suddenly give your life to Jesus. And that's a significant moment in your life. But what the parable tells us is that's just a moment. And unless you go on from that moment, unless you continue on and you continue to feed the faith that was born at that moment, you could be lost. Unless you open yourself up to living your Christianity, you're just like those 5 foolish bridesmaids. You're running on empty. As soon as that flame flickers out, you're done. And that same lesson also applies to the institutions of the church. Because a church can call itself a Christian church. It can have a beautiful building and pretty music. It can even have people in the pews, but if it's more interested in doing church than in being Christian, if it's more focused on what's happening inside the walls and not what it's doing out in the community, it's not interested in who it's reaching and who it's helping and who it's touching in the name of Christ. And the day is going to come when they realize that flame too has gone out. And they'll be standing in the darkness, knocking on the door, hoping to be let in. So here at Parkview, the question then is, do we have that flame? Do we have that fire burning within us here at Parkview that marks us as Christian? It means that marks us as living that Christian life? I think it does. I can see it in the volunteers and mission, in the way that our Parkview family throws itself into that auction every year to raise money so that the VIM can go on their mission. You see it in the Good News Club, where we bring children from the community into the church and teach them about God. See it in the teachers who give up their time to show our children the way or to lead Bible studies. I see it also in the good ladies of the UMW who give their time to minister to each other and to families who are mourning and providing meals at funerals. And all of the other things that they do. And I see it in the youth who are sometimes eager, just now finding their footing on their Christian journeys and figuring out how they're going to go forward. Could that flame burn even brighter? Could the light from our lamp be spread wider? Are we prepared to keep feeding that flame? That's a question that we all have to ask, and we all have to answer. Have we done all we can? Or is the party just getting started for us? That's the question.